What's up, you guys? This is Devin with CenturyFX Studios, back with another video, and today we're going to be talking about a lot of things having to do with manual mode, but it's going to be more about knowing your camera. And chances are, if you know how to shoot in manual mode, you know your camera, you can control your camera to its pretty much with ends, and you don't have any problems going into any different environments, getting the maximum image quality based off of what you thought in your head. Another way to get the maximum image quality and control out of your camera and defeating what people might think to be a weakness is knowing your camera's weaknesses. You gotta know your camera's weaknesses before you can defeat them. And this is a big prop to people when they purchase a camera. For example, for those of you who don't know, I just purchased the Canon 5D Mark II. And a lot of people were mad at me in the comments. At least a few people were mad at me in the comments talking about, Canon 5D Mark II, Devin, that's a dinosaur of a camera. And yes, it does have its weaknesses, but I knew all of its weaknesses before I purchased it, and I still am hyper aware of all the 5D Mark II's weaknesses before I go into the field and doing professional work. And I have to tell you guys that not only is it better than the 80D with image quality, but I have not had any dissatisfied customers throughout that entire time I've had it for almost a year now. Now you have to understand your camera's weaknesses because that will distinguish what price you'll be buying for a camera. For example, if you think that buying a D810 or a D850 and will get you better pictures, but you're doing sports photography and you forget that it only has like a 6 frames per second buffer, or excuse me, a 6 frames per second drive mode on it, and it's buffering quick because it takes almost 40 megapixel images during sport, you might be working against yourself. Why? Because you don't know your camera's weaknesses. The weakness of the D850 and the D810, or excuse me, the D810 specifically on the Nikon side, is that they have huge files. Those huge files are hard to process, especially on a D800 and the early D800 cameras that didn't work to improve this. Now the D850 is bearable, but the D810, the D800E, all these other D800 cameras from Nikon that were younger, or excuse me, older, they struggle with being able to allocate the right amount of memory for your drive mode for sports because they got to truck a lot of memory. The technology wasn't there for Nikon at that price point. So they gave you the best they could at that price point, I would think, especially it being Nikon, who is on the ropes when it comes to the business aspect of photography and selling cameras. So when you have a camera that has a big weakness, you have to compensate for it. You have to not shoot so much. And in the world of sports photography and action and anything that you can't predict, shooting a lot of frames per second is kind of their thing. 10 frames per second, 12, 13, 14, and in the A9's case with the 1DX Mark III, 20 frames a second. That's almost video. You might be saying, well, Devin, you must be spraying and praying. You must be doing this, that. You must be doing that because there's no way you need all those frames. No, you do not need all those frames. You do not need 20 frames within a second to get off the right moment. You need more like 3 to 4 to maybe 5. But the instance between each frame, that time between each frame is so pivotal that you might go because you have to understand, if you're shooting sports and things like that, you might have soccer players that are doing multiple things at multiple different. The ball can move faster than your camera can in most situations. So when you're tracking, you have to be ready, regardless if you can fathom what's going on. Most of the time when people use DSLRs anyway, they can't shoot or they don't even know what's going on because the screen blacks out for a certain percentage of a second. So you have to understand the situation you're in. You have to understand your camera's weaknesses. You have to understand that the camera's weak in the fact that it blacks out. Even mirrorless cameras are more prevalent of this. They black out. Now, if you have the A9 and something over $3,000, you're less likely to see this blackout. But 5D Mark IVs, your 1DX Mark IIs, 3s, 1DX Mark I, most cameras that are DSLRs black out for a slight lag of time before you're able to actually understand what you've got. Now, the A9 has like a video feed. It's like a live feed. You can literally see it through the eyepiece, and where it just kind of puts like little square brackets over the image to let you know that you took a picture. But you can take those things silently, and you can take them fast. So that's the difference between those two cameras. But most people can't afford those types of cameras, so you also have to know your weaknesses of your camera. Chances are, if you have a camera under the price of $4,000, there are some prevalent weaknesses about it. For example, if you have the 80D, the 90D, the 70D, the 60D, all these cameras are crop frame sensors, which means they don't let as much light into the camera at any given time that a full frame camera can. because that sensor size is regulated. It's a 1.6x crop. And if you have a Canon, which is a 1.6x crop, that's even smaller than the Nikon crop, which is 1.5, and the Sony crop, which is 1.5 on their D600s, or excuse me, their 3100s for Nikon. And then in the Sony case, you got the D6000 or A6000, excuse me. These names and numbers tend to get a lot of really confusing when you know a lot about a lot of different camera companies. But nevertheless, you need to understand your camera's weaknesses because you can get a cheaper camera if you know how to use it. For example, that's why I got the 5D Mark II, because even though it only shoots like 3.9 frames a second and it has a 21 megapixel sensor, which makes it even worse because that was the biggest megapixel sensor, one of the biggest megapixel sensors that Canon had on the market for DSLRs at the time. So you can tell that these cameras were struggling to process the image, so the buffer was pretty bad, you know. And I was coming from the 7D Mark I when in the 80D. These are 8 frames a second cameras with even or even more megapixels on the 80D side. So they were really trucking megapixels, but that 5D Mark II can't do that. But then you might say to yourself, well, why would you get a weaker camera or an older camera? Because marketers will let you or convince you to make you believe that the older cameras are the weaker ones. Why? Because they cost less. But no, I've actually gotten better image quality out of the 5D Mark II than any of the other Canon cameras that I've used, like the 7D, the T1i, the 7D Mark II. I've gotten better images out of the 5D Mark II than I think, in my opinion, the 5DSR, which is a newer camera than the 5D Mark II. Why? Because on any given time, when I was taking a picture with the 5DSR, it's 50 megapixel chunky files, but those 50 megapixel files really did promote a bit of noise. And I'm not saying that megapixels contribute directly to noise, but with a certain amount of technology, at a certain point in time, it really did feel that way. And the 5DSR is one of those culprits that actually presented a lot more noise with a lot more megapixels. Now, I don't know if this is true, and I haven't done the research on this megapixel to noise correlation, but the 5DSR is a really noisy camera in comparison to all the other cameras that it came out with. Now, like Tony Northup said, I do agree with him that you can trade some of that detail for noise and still have a comparable image as the 5D Mark IV and the A7R Mark II. Those were the comparable cameras at the time that competed with the 5DSR. But you also have to know that camera's weakness as well. You also have to know that no camera is perfect, and that even if you're buying a camera, that if it's new, just because it's new doesn't mean it's the best camera, and doesn't mean it doesn't have flaws. Canon is known for doing this, stripping perfectly good settings like 24p out of video settings and making the sensors smaller, and therefore they become more noisy, giving you a little bit less image quality for the amount of money that you spend in comparison to Nikon and Sony. Remember that Sony makes Nikon sensors, so a lot of their image quality feats are exactly the same, which is why I believe that Sony's going to buy Nikon, but that's a whole nother story all in itself. Go look at my video if you want to see what I think about that. But know what your specs are. That's another thing you need to know. Know exactly what every spec is and why it would be a hindrance to you. For example, the 5D Mark II, in my case, only has like 9 autofocus points. And back in those days, just like today, and on a DSLR, the best focusing comes from the center of the frame. Oh, I cannot stress this enough. A lot of manufacturers will fool you into thinking 500 autofocus points, 600 autofocus, 1,000 autofocus points on a DSLR is a great thing. But the DSLR, I don't know why this is, but DSLRs don't focus all the way to the edges of the screen. You might notice here that I have the, let me see how I'm trying to square out this frame. You might notice that I have the G7 on the film right now. This whole frame I'm able to actually focus with, but it's a mirrorless camera. It's not a DSLR. But for whatever reason, DSLRs have never been able to focus all the way outside of the frame or outside to the edges of the frame. And you think that the 1DX Mark II and probably even the 1DX Mark III would be able to focus out to the edges of the frame, but it's still kind of sparse in comparison to all the full frame mirrorless cameras that come beside it. And I'm pretty sure the EOS R can focus a lot closer to the outskirts of the frame than the 1DX, which is the flagship for the DSLR realm of Canon. So know your camera's weakness. Also, a lot of people get gassed up, or gear acquisition syndrome. People get gassed up into buying all of these newer cameras, the newest camera on the block, and they don't really have a legitimate reason to do it. And so they get into this mode of buying gear, thinking that'll improve their image quality, where they need to be studying color. They need to be studying supplementary colors, complementary colors. They need to be studying what reflections do to your image. They need to be studying composition, the rule of thirds, and understanding why the images are not as sharp as they could be. Because I could put two cameras side by side and take them with the most optimal image settings, and you couldn't tell the difference between some of these cameras in a lot of the situations. So one of the things you need to do as a photographer is really stop and think, what am I doing wrong, or what can I do better? Am I just shooting in auto mode all the time and that makes my images look out of focus because it's automatically focusing on whatever it wants to focus, or the exposure is always off because I'm not actually giving my camera a bearing like a gray card to do its exposure off of, or my white balance, my colors are always off because I never custom white balance or get the exact white balance or go into post-production with my pictures, or my pictures don't look as juicy because they always bake the colors and the profiles into the pictures in camera. Why? Because I shoot in JPEG all the time. So what is your hindrance? What is hindering your camera? Because if you take a picture with a $3,000 camera, but you don't know what you're doing, anybody with a $1,000 SL1, SL2, SL3 maybe, I think they're still around the grand, can come and trounce your image. If they have better lighting, better creativity, leading lines, all these things that make a great image. Composition, if they study the location and they're doing landscape photography, if they studied that location, came out during golden hour, or came out during a time where the sky was clear and you could see all the different textures of color in this, or different hues of color in the sky because the sky was clear, or they come out during a cloudy morning, or they got up at 6 o'clock in the morning and stuff like that. Just because you have a 5 DSR and you have 50 megapixels does not mean that you're gonna beat that person. Matter of fact, I'm more inclined to put my money on the person who studied the location, done everything they could possibly do creatively, with the perspective, with the height of the camera, with the with the aperture of the camera, knowing manual mode, understanding manual. I'm more likely to put their money on the person who has experience behind that camera than the person who shelled out $6,000 for 1DX and don't know how to use it. See what I'm saying? So there's a whole bunch of things that you need to understand about photography before you go into thinking, oh, I need the newest, best, latest, greatest camera, thinking it's stronger. You need to understand your camera's weaknesses. That's why they came out with the phrase, the best camera you have is the one you have with you, because a lot of people don't value their cameras enough to use them to their maximum potential. What new lenses have you looked into? What apertures are you running with? Are you still running with kit lenses and you think it's your camera's problem? No, you got to bring light to that camera. You can't be running with a 3.5 to 5.6 lens and think that you're going to get the best out of that camera. You got to have your 1.8s, your 1.2s. You got, well, maybe not 1.2s. Maybe 1.4, 1.8 lenses, your 2.8 lenses, your 70 to 200s, 24 to 70s, and 14 to 24s, whatever your zoom lens. You need prime lenses to get those best images out of your cameras. You see what I'm saying? I'm shooting on a micro 4/3 camera with a Canon lens that's a 1.4 lens. That camera though is $300, $400. The lenses cost more than the cameras, and a lot of people don't understand it or don't respect it. Like, why would this lens cost more than the camera? It's the camera that takes the picture, right? But the lens and the physics behind resolving light has everything to do with your camera's ability to capture an accurate image, capture a good, well-lit image with bokeh and all these things that you revere, that you see photographers on Instagram throwing at you all the time, left and right, bokeh and all these sharp images that you're like, how did you get your image that sharp? Well, a lot of times I realized recently that they're not even sharpening these images up in post because they know how to use their camera and they know all the elements that keep from a sharp image. So know your camera's weaknesses. Know all the elements that may be stopping you from getting the results that you want. And understand that the camera, and most of the time, based off of my students and what I've been hearing on the streets, is a lot better than you portray it to be. It's a lot better than you think. Sometimes I just go back to older cameras just to get a feel. Now you might be saying, okay, Devin, now you've said your feel about why you need to know your camera's weaknesses. Why do you upgrade your cameras, Devin? Well, first off, I'm a pro photographer. I do this pretty much every single day of my life. And if I'm not photographing in the field, I'm studying about how to get better with business and all those other things, all these aspects of being a sole proprietor. Now, you have to understand that with that business and that name and that cloud and all of that on your back, all these elements on your shoulders as a photographer, at some point you got to be competitive because there's a lot of photographers out there. Like I've told you guys before, photography is more important than it's ever been in the world, pretty much, in history. But people don't really respect photographers, and you really need to compete just to stay afloat. And a lot of times, if you don't have the word of mouth, or if you don't have a network, or if you don't have people surrounding you and talking about you like you think they should, then you're going to have to create that. You're going to have to make people make a double take on your images. So that means knowing your camera inside and out, being not afraid to be able to use manual mode, not afraid to be able. I always do this to myself. What could I have done to make that image better? Done with CenturyFX Studios. Stay tuned for the next video.